Welcome to the second quiz video. We're going to start with multiplying, dividing rational numbers, which has been the main focus of the past 2 weeks. So we're going to begin with just the rules. So these are things we need to have memorized absolutely 100%. You need to know this on the test. On the quiz on Friday, I won't give it to you. You need to know these. So we have a positive times a positive. That's going to give us a positive. We have a positive divided by a positive. That's going to give us a positive. A negative times a negative. We also get a positive. And a negative divided by a negative. We also get a positive. So the big takeaway rule with multiplying and dividing rational numbers, if we have the same signs, then we're going to get a positive answer. Absolutely need to know that. Then we have a positive times a negative. That's going to give us a negative. Positive divided by a negative, also going to give us a negative. Negative times a positive, that's going to be negative. And negative divided by positive, that's going to be negative. So again, the other key rule is that when we're multiplying and dividing and we have different signs, we're always going to get a negative answer. Absolutely need to know that. Okay, so now we're going to move in to looking at one example of integers for multiplication and division. All right, so we're going to look at our first example. So example 1, multiplying integers. We have negative 6 times negative 4. So the first thing we should do is figure out, will our answer be positive or negative? Well, we have a negative multiplied by a negative. So at this point, we have to know a negative times a negative. Since they're the same sign, we're going to get a positive. So then, we cannot worry about the signs anymore. We know our answer is going to be positive. And just multiply the absolute values of the numbers. So we just multiply 6 times 4. 6 times 4 is 24. We can count up 6, 12, 18, 24. Or the other way, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. So 6 times 4 is 24. And since our answer is going to be positive, since we have a negative and we have two negatives, then our final answer is going to be positive 24. So even though we have two negatives, we're going to get the positive. All right, and then we're going to look at one example of dividing integers. We have negative 24 divided by 6. So first, let's figure out the sign. So we have a negative number divided by a positive number. When we have a negative divided by a positive, we have different signs. So we're going to get a negative answer. So then at this point, we can kind of ignore the signs. We need to figure out what 24 divided by 6 is. So 24 divided by 6 is asking what number times 6 equals 24. So what number times 6 is 24? Well, we just talked about that up here. Since 6 times 4 is 24, then the answer here is going to be 4. Because 6 times 4 gives me 24. That's the relationship between multiplication and division. Now I just, to go back and deal with the signs again, I had that negative divided by a positive. So my final answer for this problem is going to be negative 4. And that's what I'm going to box in. That's an example when we're multiplying and dividing integers. We're going to move on then to look at an example of multiplying and dividing fractions. So now we're going to look at an example of multiplying fractions with negatives. So we have negative 2/3 times negative 18 over 8. 18 eighths. So first let's talk about the sign. We have a negative times a negative. So our answer is going to be positive. Get that out of the way. Then we're going back to our old skills. For multiplying fractions, you multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators. So you don't need a common denominator, so multiplying fractions is a lot easier than adding fractions. So we're going to multiply across now. We have 2/3 times 18 eighths. So we can do 2 times 18. That's going to be 36. We can do that off to the side if you need to. And then 3 times 8 as the denominator. So then we have 24. At that point, we're going to want to simplify. So we're going to want to see if there's a factor of both of these that we can divide by to make it simpler. Find an equivalent fraction. So me looking at this, you'd have to do a little work. But 36 is the same thing as 12 times 3. And 24 is the same thing as 12 times 2. So I can cancel out those 12s, and I'm left with 3 over 2, or 3 halves. And then I need to see, okay, that's in my simplified form. I could also make that 1 and 1 half if I want to turn it into a mixed number. And then my answer is going to be positive here, like we talked about, because we had a negative times a negative. So my final answer is going to be 1 and 1 half. So that's the example. Again, we find the sign, and then we're multiplying across. Then we're going to look one for dividing fractions. Negative 3/5 divided by 2/3. So we have a negative divided by a positive, and that gives us a negative. So we cannot worry about the sign anymore, because we know whatever we get, our answer has to be negative. So we can just focus on the positive versions of the numbers. So we're going to have 3/5 divided by 2/3. Remember the rule that when we're dividing by a number, that's the same as multiplying by the number's reciprocal, which is when you flip the numerator and the denominator. So you learned in 6th grade, I think, keep, change, flip. Right, and that works. You can think about it that way. So we're going to write 3/5. That's what we're keeping. We're changing the division sign to multiplication, and then we're flipping the numerator and the denominator. So 2/3 turns into 3 halves, 3 over 2. At this point, we have a multiplication problem, just like we just did. We multiply the numerators. 3 times 3 is 9. We multiply the denominators. 5 times 2 is 10. And I can't simplify that any further. I have a nice proper fraction of 9/10. So then I'm like, okay, that's basically my answer, but let me check my sign. For my sign, I had to have a negative times a positive in this case, or divided by a positive. So that means my answer is negative. So my final answer overall is going to be negative 9/10. And that's what I would box in as my answer. Okay, so we're going to end at looking at 2 examples of addition and subtraction. One problem of each will show up on the quiz because, well, this we hadn't actually been quizzed on when we're dealing with fractions. And then for example 5, this is something we keep doing in the do nows because people keep getting this wrong. And a lot of students got it wrong on the quiz. So we're going to review this. So a question like -6 minus 2 will appear on the quiz on Friday. So the first thing we need to do is rewrite this as an addition problem. So -6 we don't touch, and then we're subtracting 2. Subtracting 2 is the same thing as adding -2. We talked about how subtracting a number is the same thing as adding that number's opposite. So subtracting 2 is the same thing as adding -2, because the opposite of 2 is -2. At this point, we're in pretty good shape. We have 2 negative numbers that we're going to add. So since they're both negative, we add the absolute values. 6 plus 2 is 8. And then we keep the negative sign. So our final answer here is -8. That part, we're always in good shape with. The issue is being able to think in our heads that this subtraction is the same as adding a negative. All right, and then lastly, we have adding fractions. So when we're adding fractions, we do need a common denominator. We already have this in this case. So we have 1/2 plus -3 halves. So we couldn't do this if we didn't have a common denominator. But now we have a common denominator. When we add fractions, we are going to focus on adding the numerators, and then we keep the denominator. In this case, let's first take a look at our signs. We have a positive and we have a negative. Remember, when we are adding, this is not multiplication. Super, super, super important. Not multiplication. When we were adding and we had different signs, the rule was we subtracted the absolute values and then kept the sign of the bigger, greater number, the greater absolute value. So, in this case, we have a -3 halves and a +1/2. So we're going to, since they're opposite signs and we're adding, we're going to subtract the absolute value. So we're going to do 3 halves minus 1 half. Then now we can subtract 3 minus 1, subtract the numerators, and we get 2. And keep the denominator, so we also have 2. So then we have 2 divided by 2, which is just equal to 1. So then we just have to decide, is our answer positive 1 or negative 1? So let's go back to our two numbers. We had a positive 1 half, and we had a negative 3 halves. Well, the absolute value of 1 half is 1 half. The absolute value of negative 3 halves is 3 halves. And 3 halves is bigger than 1. That's the same thing as 1 1/2. That's bigger than 1 half. So we have to go with the negative sign. Since the negative 3 halves was negative, we choose that sign because it's the bigger number, the bigger absolute value. So our final answer is negative 1. So you have notes on this. It's been a little bit since we've done it. We had notes on that. 1, 5. So take a look at that if you need to. But this is it. This is everything you'll need to see on the quiz. It's going to be mainly problems with the first 2 examples. But like I said, you'll see 1 problem like this and 1 problem like this. Be sure to study. Come get help after school if you need it. And good luck tomorrow.